So welcome everyone to Resolving Conflict presentation. Today we're going to look at a particular model. This approach to resolving conflict is not the only approach. There are many ways in which people can look at the issue of conflict or contention in relationships. And there are various approaches to how we address these phenomena in relationships. But the one that I'm looking at particularly comes from a particular model that was designed by what we call integrated couples therapy, ICT. This is the therapist's manual, and this is the manual for those who are interested in learning a bit about the model. So this is written for everyday language. So it's written for people who would like to learn about reconciling differences. So this is what I'm basing these models on. Yeah. So reconcilable differences. It'll come up on the PowerPoint as well. But so this is approach from this particular model, it's not a very complex model, and it's quite an interesting model. So before we start, we're going to watch a video. The video is not very long. It's about 1.5 minutes. It's quite humorous, and it's really about an interaction between a couple and kind of how that plays out. So as you watch that, just keep in mind of what we're talking about and what we're going to cover today. So bear with me as I...
Battery 100%. Connected to K64HP7H2.
Okay, we're about to take off.
It's just, there's all this pressure, you know? And sometimes it feels like it's right up on me, and I can just feel it, like literally feel it in my head, and it's relentless, and I don't know if it's gonna stop. I mean, that's the thing that scares me the most, is that I don't know if it's ever gonna stop.
You do have a nail in your head.
It is not about the nail.
Are you sure? Because, I mean, I'll bet if we got that out of there...
Stop trying to fix it.
No, I'm not trying to fix it. I'm just pointing out that maybe the nail is causing...
You always do this. You always try to fix things when what I really need is for you to just listen.
See, I don't think that is what you need. I think what you need is to get the nail...
See, I don't know.
Okay, fine. I will listen. Fine.
It's just... Sometimes it's like... There's this achy... I don't know what it is. It's not going well at all. And all my sweaters are snagged. I mean, all of them.
That sounds really hard.
It is. Thank you. Ow!
Come on, if you would just...
Don't!
Music's quite good as well. Okay, so when you watch the video, particularly in the context of what we're talking about today, what did you notice? What were some things that resonated with you, or what was going on?
The problem was obvious.
There were two
To who?
There were two different needs.
Yes.
She wanted to be listened and
So
to fix it.
to the guy, the problem was Okay, but that may not have been the same for the girl. Okay, what else? So they are focusing on two different things in the interaction.
Do you mind if we stand at the back here?
Oh, there it is.
So here's, what else did you notice from the video?
It's the coolest video in the world.
So now you're going to have to help them understand a little bit about the video. So what else did you notice in the video, what thoughts do you have about what you watched?
The problem was obvious to one party and resented by the other.
Yes. Mm. And perhaps as it played out, it looked like there were different two problems in what each of them were focusing on. Yeah.
She wanted to be listened to about how she felt about the problem.
Yeah.
She didn't want him to necessarily fix the nail sticking out of her head.
Right.
But he found
So we
it
were
hard to
focusing on
focus,
two different
didn't he?
things.
You could see him, he was like, she was saying, you know, this is achy, and he's like, yeah, because you got it in your head, you know, and he found it hard to listen because he could see it. He could see the nail in the head.
Well, he was fixed.
Yeah.
Or preoccupied by what he was seeing, may not be fixed or preoccupied by what he was hearing. All right, what else? No, you unfortunately didn't watch it. Okay, when during the video, when did you notice, when did something change?
When he actually started listening.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, she had to tell him, I just want you to listen.
Yes. But he had a choice. He could have said, no, actually what the issue is, he could have stuck with the nail. But he did. He began to listen. And then what happened? When he began to listen, what happened?
She softened.
Yeah. In fact, you felt the whole matter kind of settle down for a moment until they tried to embrace and the nail got in the way. And they went back to where they were, focusing on what they wanted to focus on. So what we see there is quite typical in relationships, how interaction may play out, particularly when the interaction it has some contention or is contentious, or there's a differences in how people are seeing what two people are talking about. So let's talk a little bit about conflict. So what comes to mind when you think about conflict? So how do you feel, or how do you see conflict? So this is about your experience with conflict and what's your attitude towards conflict. Yeah.
I feel like a separation of the oneness. It's with anybody.
Mm-hmm.
It's like there's no more at oneness. It's like I'm here, you're there, and something yucky is in the middle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So sometimes contention, tension, conflict can separate two people. Absolutely. Yeah. What else? So I want to get an idea from you about how you feel about conflict. For example, in our relationship, I don't like conflict. And the reason for that is because I tend to be a peacemaker. So my natural tendency is to want to sort of make peace in relationships. So when there's tension or contention in our relationship, I want to naturally pull away. So in other words, I don't particularly like conflict. But I have learned that conflict is something we have to deal with in relationships. So even though my natural tendency is to want to pull away, avoid it, I don't. And I would tend to address it. And sometimes it goes well, and sometimes it doesn't. Okay? And there are sometimes when I will avoid it, and then there are sometimes when I think, no, I need to actually address this, we need to work through this. So that's kind of my feeling and how I feel about conflict. So what about the rest of you? My wife is a little different. She doesn't mind conflict. She walks straight into conflict. And I'm walking back from the conflict. So we are very different when it comes to our attitude towards conflict. So what are others' thoughts about your feelings about that?
Yeah, ours is kind of similar. Mine, my husband, where I want to get to the, nitty gritty of what's going on, and then he doesn't want to hurt my feelings, or and then I get frustrated because he's not being real with me. So then I just shut down.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do the old silent treatment for a while.
What a great description of what happens in most cases.
Yeah.
All right. That's really how it plays out often. Is there's an issue that arises, two people try to resolve, and it breaks down. All right. And it breaks down because there's some tension, and sometimes it can result in conflict. Not necessary. So when we think of conflict, it doesn't necessarily have to be the big blow up. It can be any disagreement, any discomfort in that relationship that we're dealing with. So a great example. Any other thoughts, comments? Yeah.
We just had a class with Abinadar Lameko,
Yeah.
and he was talking about communication effectively. He was saying how men don't normally like to, they need to walk away for a bit and not talk about the issue, but we're women. We need to talk about the issue because it's words and it's comforting to us, and it's actually part of the resolution for us. And men have a tendency, oh listen, I'm at the heat of my moment, I need to walk away for a bit, but we see that as, hey, we need this resolved, so there's that there, and we're talking about superficial conversations and personal conversations, and women are more personalised and internalised, and men are more externalised and need to calm down for a bit, then they can come back in.
Yeah, absolutely. So what you're describing there is sometimes at the core of why there's differences in relationships. And one of the obvious ones is the gender difference. Okay, so I mean we've heard from a few yet today that how the different genders address or respond to tension and conflict. So in terms of bringing, in terms of that playing out in our relationship, one of the ways in which it plays out is because of the difference between male and female. So there are specific temperaments between male and female, but there's also characteristics that overlap. So we're not completely different, but there are some aspects of us that sits more naturally with males and sits more naturally with females. So there's the gender bias that comes into play. But in terms of how we respond to conflict, another important influence is how we are brought up. So as we grow up in our families, we would be exposed to how our parents deal with conflict, how our parents deal with tension, how they deal with contention. And over time, we will model those ways of behaviors because that's probably the only way we know. And so we will bring into relationships that which was modeled from our upbringing. And then there's another component. It's our temperament, right? Our personality and temperament. So how we are. So remember my temperament, I tend to be a peacekeeper, peacemaker. That plays out in how I respond to tension, contention and conflict. So we bring all these components into a relationship and they play out in the daily interaction between two people. So here's a quote. Can someone read that for me?
Differences, eternal differences planted by God in a single family, so that there may always be colour, sorrow perhaps, but colour in the daily grain.
Right. So what that's basically saying is, if there was no tension, conflict, contention in relationships would be a bit boring, sort of mundane and not very exciting. So what it's saying here is actually conflict brings colour into the relationship. It brings richness. Right? It brings some mystery into the relationship. Otherwise our relationship's just going to be even keel, just all the time the same. And that apparently is quite boring. It's sort of a grey, as opposed to no colour in the relationship. Just to emphasize, this model comes from Integrated Couples Therapy, ICT, developed by Christiansen and Jacobson. It's a bit difficult for you to see from that angle, is it? And here's the material that you can certainly have a look at it. They have a website as well if you're interested in learning more about the approach and the material. So, when couples engage in conflict, what usually happens? So how does it play out, usually? What do we notice? You can speak about your own relationships, or you can speak about what you see around you.
We talk about our neighbors. You always speak louder and louder and louder. And
yeah. So sometimes where there's conflict, there's a raising of voices. Right, absolutely.
People get upset.
People get upset, yeah. So there's a triggering of emotions. Yeah, and those emotions can be varied. Can be from something from upset to frustration to anger and so forth. Absolutely.
It can trigger card files of past events, and now you're talking about things that weren't even on the table.
Yes, absolutely. So yeah, one of the things we notice is that when there's conflict, especially two things. One, if that's a strategy that you learn from your upbringing, so if your parents did that, you may bring it into how you respond to conflict. Or if you're in a process of trying to sort something out and there's some tension there and you find you're losing the grip or you're losing the battle, you may resort to more extreme measures, which would be to bring up the past, because now you're desperate. Right? And you throw in everything to make sure that you can get the advantage in this interaction. Any other thoughts about what you notice about conflict in relationships?
Nobody's really listening to anybody.
Yeah, nobody's listening.
They're trying to think of something to come back with instead of actually listening.
Yeah.
And then sometimes the woman actually remembers things that hasn't happened yet.
Okay.
Only when they're losing. But yeah, they're focusing on a rebuttal instead of, their pride gets in the way, and then they just get stupid. And, like even me. Like, I'm not perfect either.
Yeah, it's a very typical thing to do. That when there's contention and we believe that we're right, our point of view is how it's going to resolve this matter. Then regardless of what the other person's saying is, you're always thinking about how you're going to react or respond to what they're saying, because you want to reaffirm your position, restate your position, reinforce your position. So you're not really listening, are you? Not really. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. What's the problem? So what's the real problem? What's the actual problem in contention and tension?
Not being understood. Not being, I think it's that word, validating whatever the other person wants.
Yeah.
So, we actually had one before we came down from Auckland. We almost didn't come down because we had a huge argument. It was like, and we haven't had, like, we got married last year. We were like in the honeymoon. That is really awesome argument. And it was so awesome that it got to the point where I was like, I just want a blessing now because I'm angry. I can't stop being angry.
Yeah.
It was really funny because it started off with a nothing burger and it eventuated the whole 3-course meal of a whole nothing burger.
Yeah.
And it ended up being that I tried to get a blessing so that I wouldn't be elevated. And he was already elevated too, so there's no way you can get a blessing on either of them.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's just a big, huge misunderstanding.
So integrative couples therapy, they say that when there's tension and conflict, that's not the problem. So if that's not the problem, what is the problem?
Communicate. How you communicate.
Yeah. Right, absolutely, yeah. So the issue is, the problem is not resolving the problem, the issue is how it's been resolved. That becomes the problem, right? So when it breaks down, right, that means that you're not doing this properly, you're not doing it well, you're not doing it effectively. So whatever you're arguing or whatever the reason for the contention or tension actually becomes secondary. Right? The primary issue here is not the problem, but actually how are you trying to address the problem. So that's what ICT talk about in this model. So here's a bit of couple counseling humor. So you know a leopard can't change its spots. So I'm not asking you to change your spots, I'm just asking you to take out the garbage. Right? So we see this playing out a lot in relationships where one spouse is trying to change the nature or the way the other person is. Okay, so now we're going to look at the theory, right, or the mechanics of conflict or tension. So ICT, they propose this particular approach where they say in terms of conflict, there are three primary components. So basically what they're saying here is they identify that one, there's a theme, what you're fighting about. Then there's the polarizing process, is what happens what happens when you are engaging in the conversation. And then the third component is the mutual trap, is how it leaves people feeling. Okay, so if you go to the doctor and the doctor asks you, so what's wrong? In other words, the doctor is assessing what's wrong with you. So he'll ask you, tell me about what you're experiencing, what are the symptoms and so forth. Basically, he's doing a diagnosis. And in terms of this model, this is the diagnosis component. This is the therapist working out what the problem is. So we're going to look at each of these components in a bit more detail, starting with the theme. So whenever there's conflict, ICT identified that there's actually only 5, right, aspects or 5 themes related to all conflict or tension in relationships. So number 1, they say the conflict or tension between closeness and distance. So that's the differences in intimacy, desired intimacy. And in this particular model, when they refer to intimacy, it's a much broader category. It's not only the intimacy related to physical contact, but it's all forms of intimacy. So it can be in terms of how people connect, and people connect in different ways. The other primary conflict theme is control and responsibility. So who controls which domains in the relationship? The other one is you don't love me. Yes, I do. It is you that doesn't love me. That often leaves a couple feeling unappreciated, unloved, uncared for, misunderstood, etc. And then conventionality versus unconventionality, which is opposites attract. People are different, and people like those differences, and they're attracted to them. Sometimes they are attracted to a characteristics of someone else, which they would like to be themselves, but they're not like that, and so they pursue that. And then we have the artist and the scientist. This is about the differences in what people, how they are, and what they focus on in life. So the artist is spontaneous, enjoys life, versus the scientist who's goal-directed, focused, and task-orientated. All right? So we all like this. We all fit into these categories in some way. The interesting thing is that when there's conflict in relationships, this is very seldom acknowledged. In fact, it's very seldom recognized. Right? It's at the heart. It's the origin of the conflict. So whether you're fighting about who picks up the children, how you discipline, where you're going to go for holiday, even though there may be contention around that, it's actually sitting in one of these categories. And the problem here is if you can put that aside and say, hey, this is about you wanting to be me wanting to be closer to you, and this is something that I don't think about much, and we need to talk about that rather.
Paulo,
Yeah.
With their domains, when it says who controls, the domains of married life, what do you mean by domains?
It's aspects of married life. So who controls, say,
Like
the
the money,
finances, the money. So who controls how you discipline the children? Who decides on that? So it's decisions you make in the marriage about components of married life. Yeah.
Thank you.
So in more detail, closeness versus distance. This is connecting versus wanting to be alone. So you can see how this can play out in a relationship and how it can create a contention. What is interesting here is that the distancer holds more power. And the reason why the distancer holds more power, so the distance is the one who prefers to be on their own, prefers to have wide space, like me.
You're going to say like the one that retreats.
So yes, I do. I'm the retreater in the relationship. I like wide space. I like to do things on my own, and my wife is the opposite. So we have to jostle and find a happy medium between those preferences with the two of us. So as I was saying, the distancer holds more power because you only need one person to be the distancer. Right. So if I want space, if I want to go and play sport, right, if I want to engage in a hobby that's away from my spouse, it would be nice to have a provision. It would be nice to she'd be okay with that. But if she's not, I can decide, all right, it doesn't bother me. I'll do it anyway. So you're not dependent on another person to be able to apply that approach. Whereas the closeness person needs the other person to respond to their wishes. So if you want closeness, you have to ask the other person, hey, when we're walking in the street, I'd like you to hold my hand. Now, if the other person says, well, I'm not going to do it, there was not much you're going to do about it, is it? Right? And so the closeness always depends on the other person to respond to those requests or those demands. And so the power sits with the distancer. It can be quite confusing, that jostling between the distance and the closeness now, in terms of sometimes it's related to the statement, go away and stop leaving me alone. Right?
Is there a gender connected to the closest versus the distance?
Yes.
Is it always the female that's the closest?
It's not always, but it's usually. Yeah. Yeah, it is usually. So if you think about it, right in the beginning I talked about gender differences and our nature, where certain things fit more naturally with males and with females. Females being a natural nurturer will have the tendency for them to be the one that pursues closeness more than the male. But that's not a hard and fast rule. I mean, it can reverse. It can be the other way around. So, both spouses, we're back to you don't love me, yes I do, it's you that doesn't love me. Both spouses experience each other as unloving. So not just one, both are experiencing these emotions where they feel unloved, unappreciated, uncared for, misunderstood, and so forth. This is also interesting that neither couple consider that love can be expressed in different ways. So we've heard the term maybe love language, how people express their intimacy. Often in this situation, that is negated. In other words, it's not recognized. And it's important to be able to recognize that in terms of contention. What was the saying there?
Yeah, that's funny.
Yeah.
So,
the man who says he's willing to meet you halfway is usually a poor judge of distance.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's often a point of contention in relationships. It sits right up there as number one, no, not number one, but number two, number three, in terms of reasons for fallouts in relationships. Conventionality versus unconventional. This is the adventurous versus the conservative one. Couples are attracted to each other because they desire to emulate. So this is really interesting. This is what I was referring to early on. So couples are attracted to each other because they want to emulate the other person's character, but they become disappointed, should I say, when they discover that the other is becoming the opposite to what they thought they were in the beginning. You know? So what happens in this situation is that maybe a person becomes attracted to someone else who's very different in terms of they being adventurous, spontaneous, like to go on holidays, like to try things out. And they think, oh, I'd like to do that, but I don't like it, it's not me. But hey, I really like that about that person, and that's what I find attractive in them. And then they get married, and then over time the adventurer settles down and says, I've done that in my life, now I want to be more conservative, I want to stay home, I don't really want to do anything. And the other one says, well, what happened to the person I married? I don't remember you being like that. And so, sorry for my back. I
will always cherish the initial misconception I had about you.
Yeah, isn't that an interesting saying? Hey, what happened to the person I married?
I find people fill in the blanks because at first you don't know someone, so you attribute all the positive features that you want in a spouse, but that person doesn't actually have those qualities, but they fill it in with those qualities, and it's not even real. So that's really true.
Yeah.
I mean, I've seen people do that.
The artist and the scientist. The artist believes in spontaneity and play and enjoyment of life. The scientist is pragmatic, plans for the future and sets goals and focuses on accomplishing tasks. So sometimes there's compromise in relationships, but as we see that sometimes they're misleading, in that a compromise is a settlement by which each side gets what neither wanted. So that's the definition of compromise, isn't it? Compromise is about giving up something for the better of a bigger purpose. Okay, so which of those 5 themes do you think is the number one reason for contention in relationships? Now remember that this is a research that's been done on a wide basis. It's not a church research based. So
in a specific country?
Yeah, probably in America, probably in the States. So have a guess. 10 minutes. Which one do you think is the top one? The number one? The second one, control and responsibility. It's a good one, but no. Number 3. I have 3. Yeah, anyone to take number 3?
Mine should be number 1.
So it's not number 3 either. It's number 1. Yeah, closeness versus distance tends to be the primary conflict theme in relationships. But having said that, and all of those are really interesting, and you can see how they can play out in relationships. So when there's conflict, this is how we respond to the conflict. This is our perceptions of conflict, which is now, this is actually at the heart of the problem. This is why conflict is a problem, because differences become perceived as incompatibilities. Right? So because we are different, we're incompatible. So that's the perception we have. And if we're incompatible, then this can't be worked out. Right? So which is not true. Differences are perceived as intolerable, right? Distressing and problematic. Maybe not in all cases this one, but certainly differences can be distressing and problematic. Differences are seen as the deficiencies in who? The other person. Alright? The deficiency in the other person. Alright? And it often leads to the desire to avoid contention, to try and eradicate contention, because we don't like it, because we want to avoid it or eradicate it because of these perceptions, right? It's intolerable, it's distressing and problematic, which it doesn't necessarily have to be, but that's how we see it. The polarizing process. So we've looked at the themes. Remember the model, theme, polarizing process, and the mutual trap. So we have a slide on the polarizing process. So this was, once we're trying to deal with the contention or the tension in the interaction. This is where it leads to. So bad solutions don't merely fail; they create an even bigger problem. So each spouse is focused on trying to change the other. So in the polarizing processes, this is how we respond. This is how we react to conflict or tension. All right? Trying to change the other person. When a spouse engages in change efforts, the usual outcome is polarization, and the difference are magnified. So what may have been an argument about who takes the rubbish out will become magnified to bigger things in the relationship. Usually the conflict increases rather than decreases. So that's kind of what happens during the polarizing process. So polarizing means that the two become more, the difference becomes greater, and the two sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? Grow apart. Yeah. And then the outcome of the polarizing process is the mutual trap. Now, they call it a mutual trap because, regardless of the outcome of the interaction, it leaves both feeling the same. Both people feel the same, although that's very seldom not acknowledged. Which often is, the mutual trap is the outcome of a polarizing process, leads to spouses feeling stuck, trapped, helpless, or desperate. And this is seldom discussed. So usually if there's some contention or tension, it'll play out and it'll break down, and that's where it'll stop. Right? Whereas if you could, from at that moment, then actually talk about the polarizing process, then you're starting to engage in a more richer form of resolving the conflict. So when we talk about this, I really feel stuck because we never seem to get past this point, or always the same thing comes up, we say the same things, and I feel like I can't get anywhere with this, and it makes me feel kind of worried about our relationship. So that conversation usually doesn't take place. It usually stops when there's contention, and then it breaks down, and then people resort to unhealthy coping mechanisms, unhealthy responses, which we will see. Okay, so a little bit about how an argument will play out. So this is the anatomy of an argument. There's the initial problem. How much time do we have? 5 minutes. So there's the content of the problem, what you're arguing about. That leads to feeling provoked, which highlights the incompatibilities between two people, which makes people feel vulnerable, which triggers off some emotions. So when we feel vulnerable, we will always experience some type of emotion, and often they are negative emotions. That leads to unsuccessful coping mechanisms. So we resort to desperate measures. So in this case, those are some examples. Maybe accusation, blame, coercing, avoidance, denial, etc. And sometimes it may lead to what we call alliances and coalitions. So alliances are where something plays out in the relationship, and it continues to play out, and you become frustrated by it, and you find yourself going to talk to someone else, which is okay, because there's nothing wrong with seeking out support and venting to someone that you can vent to. But what we have to be very careful of, if that dynamic begins to evolve, when we go to someone else, and in many cases it might be a good friend or a parent, and we go to them and say, yeah, I know, I really get frustrated in my marriage because this, and this. And that person validates everything, and then they take your side, right? And then they engage in the blame game about the other person. Then you form an alliance with that person. So every time there's contention, you go back to that person, and that alliance becomes stronger. And over time, that relationship begins to replace your marriage relationship, and that's unhealthy. And so we have to be careful because those alliances can develop without us realizing it. So there's nothing wrong with going to someone and talking to them and actually processing something that is helpful and effective. But we have to watch and monitor how that relationship is evolving and what objective it's picking up and taking on. So be aware of that. Some basic interventions. Acceptance and tolerance are your two major interventions in terms of what a therapist would do. So this is about changing the mindset. All right, so remember in the beginning I said, what's the actual problem? So the problem is people have contention and it breaks down. And we focus on the reason why that contention is there. What this is saying, and then we become aware of the contention and we don't like it and we see the contention is the problem. What ICT is saying is actually no, what really needs to happen is you need to respond differently to the contention. In fact, you need to change the way you view contention. So in this case, it's saying not all differences will be eliminated. So it's about acceptance, that there's going to be differences in relationships. They will always be there. I don't know of any relationship where there's been no differences. Right? And that the notion that differences are problematic has to change. Right? Generate empathy and compassion for each other as other's sense of entrapment, which leads to attainment of emotional acceptance. So remember the video we watched? Okay, when did that happen between the couple? When did that emotional acceptance take place? For a brief moment.
When he stopped focusing on the nail.
Yes, and when he validated how she was feeling. There was that emotional acceptance, that emotional connection, right? But unfortunately it lasted about a couple of seconds and they reverted back to what they were arguing about. Okay. And then tolerance. When acceptance is difficult to achieve, then tolerance is introduced to neutralize the behaviors, right? The negative behaviors. And then, it's the changing of the mindset, is to help a person see that differences are natural, they are inevitable, and that they may even be desired. Right? So in closing, interpersonal dynamics. Would someone like to read that quote?
Finest qualities of our nature, like the bloom of fruits, can be preserved only by the most delicate handling.
Yeah. I really like that quote because relationships are delicate and we are delicate. If we can be delicate in the way we interact with other important people in our lives, be aware of people's feelings, know that they are precious, and be mindful of how we interact determines the kind of relationship we have. When we are delicate, I believe that we create an environment where relationships can flourish, they can be enriched. So it's a wonderful quote, I think, which fits nicely with this model. So, any thoughts or questions for the last minute or so? 3 minutes? Yeah, it's warm in here, isn't it?
So what do you suggest, you know how we were saying before that males need that kind of time out, that, well, we females, we want to get into, so what do you suggest? What can we do in that moment?
It's hard to say because when that plays out, the personalities also play out. So it can play out quite differently in every situation. So what you're saying is when it breaks down, you want to remove yourself? Is that what you're saying?
Well, you don't have one tends to remove themselves and the other one tends to go and try to fight it.
Yes. Yeah.
What kind of techniques or what kind of things can we do to actually allow each other for what we both need? Yeah.
Yeah. It's really, because remember, when that's happened, you're probably fighting about something else, right? And you didn't make the connection, this is about closeness and distance. So it's about actually switching to having the conversation about that, all right? And then trying to negotiate and come to some type of compromise where both of you feel comfortable with how you're going to position those differences in that relationship. So it's about trying to remember what the fight is about really, and trying to identify which of those themes, and in this case it's the closeness distance, and recognizing, hey, this is what's actually going on here. I mean, it sounds like whenever we talk about this subject, you want to pull away because it feels like it's an infringing on your personal space. I mean, you don't have to use those words, but it's kind of what that's about. And saying, okay, so what are we going to do with this? Because, you know, I do like your company, I want to spend more time with you, or this is what I'd like, and you had a conversation and he may respond to this, I understand what you're saying, but, you know, I also liked some of my personal space, and then you had a conversation about, okay, so where do we compromise with both of us finding a happy medium with this? So it's kind of that. But having said that now, I mean, I'm having this conversation when I'm yes, yeah, and my emotions are intact, right, and I can be rational, right. So if that plays out and it falls over, when you revisit it at another time, then start at that point, at the big theme point about what is really going on here. And hopefully you would be able to engage in an interaction where both of you are comfortable having that conversation, and in a place where you both can actually accept each other's point of view, other perspective, and then accommodate that. Yeah. Of course, that's an ideal. Yeah. It may work, it may not work sometimes, it may still fall over when you try that. But that's what you're going to try to negotiate, is that aspect of the relationship. Yeah.
I'm probably not the best one to suggest anything at all, but something that I have suggested is that because I know the walk away, I want to stay here and talk about it mode, is that I suggested to my awesome husband to maybe he could do we could have lots of practice in the future, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because of more arguments that are going to come, so we can get colour in our relationship. Okay, so what I suggested was that maybe, because you got the walk away thing, and I've got the I need you to stay here thing, that maybe you mentally walk away from me for a bit, and you hover out of your body, look down at me as a daughter of God, and forgive me for whatever nail sticking out of my head, so to speak, and forgive me for my reaction to that nail that I don't want you to fix, I just want you to hear what I'm hurting about. And then when you've spiritually walked away for a bit, and you're not physically gone from me, I know you're going to be back, and when you come back, you can say, oh, listen, you were absolutely right.
So you have to practice that.
Everybody knows that we're Heavenly Father's daughter.
I mean, you say that in jest, but you know, if you practice that, if you practice that, you may be able to do that in the heat of the moment. So when you practice something, what you're creating is neural pathways in the brain associated with that condition and that behavior, right? And so if you practice it, the more you practice it, the more pronounced that pathway is in your brain, right? So that when those pathways are triggered, right, that lights up and says, hey, remember, this is what we practice.
So he doesn't physically walk away, he's like, oh.
Yes, so the brain reminds you, oh, this is what we were practicing, this is what we role played, let's give it a go. Right? That's how you train the brain to engage in behavior change.
And when he comes back, he remembers that he really loves me so good.
Well, thank you everyone for your participation.
Thank you.